Good evening, everyone, and welcome to the second day of Mercy Week here at St. Joseph's College of Maine. My name is Chris Fuller, and I'm the Chief Sponsorship and Mission Integration Officer here. All this week, we are focusing on the Sisters of Mercy's critical concern of anti-racism, each day with a focusing question. Today, our focusing question is, what is anti-racism? And my guest tonight is Dr. Brian Stanley. Brian is the Senior Vice President and Chief Operating Officer at the Energy Foundation in California. Prior to joining the Energy Foundation in California, prior to joining the Energy Foundation, Brian was the Chief Operating Officer at Hamilton Families, an organization committing to ending family homelessness in the San Francisco Bay Area. Before that, he was the Executive Director of the Oakland Public Education Fund. Throughout his career, Brian has demonstrated a robust dedication to equity and justice in both what an organization does and how it works. And Brian has some familiarity with St. Joseph's College because he was just out here last January for a public talk on our campus. And Brian has very graciously stepped in at the last minute. My guest this evening was to have been Father Brian Massingale, but Father Brian emailed me on Saturday. He had been very ill and in the hospital and just released and was not able to join us tonight. So Brian, thank you for joining us tonight at the last minute at my request. And if you have a question for us tonight, please take a look at the screen. You'll see the email address vpmission@sjcme.edu. If you have questions for myself or for Brian during our conversation, you can send them into that email account. I will be monitoring it. I'll bring it up at one other point during our conversation in case people have forgotten. And so, Brian, the topic for today, the question, as I told you, was we've devised this week as a series of questions to introduce our community to some concepts around anti-racism and this critical concern of the Sisters of Mercy. So I want to start with this question. That is, I'd like to believe, as I'm sure many people would like to believe, that I'm not a racist person. How is that different than being an anti-racist?
So how I tend to think about these things in a bit of a continuum. So if racist is one end, where I'm actively participating in systems and structures, policies that are built on disadvantaging other groups of people, and I'm conscious of that and I'm good with it, that's one point. The counter to that isn't saying I'm not racist, right? Because that is insufficient, right? The broader structures, the systems, the practices, the way I think about it is I often tell folks that as a now black father, but once a young black man, we just assumed we would have interactions with the police, and so and you would hope those interactions wouldn't be too bad. You would hope that you wouldn't go to jail. You would hope you wouldn't lose your life, and you would hope shortly after it ended, you could go on with your day or what have you. That is just a part of my reality. That's part of my reality now as I raise two black boys in Oakland. I worry incessantly about what their world will look like, not in some abstract future, but when they're riding their bikes around the neighborhood. That I could say very easily, most of the white folks that are friends of mine have no idea about that reality and have no curiosity about it. But they would say they're not racist, even though they are a participant in the system that lets that continue to be my reality, right? Versus an anti-racist positioning is to say, I am both curious and conscious about those policies. I want to understand that experience and I want to do something about it. I want to move through the world conscious that that is someone else's reality. And even if that's not my reality, that's somebody else's reality. And I have an obligation to do work and whatever that needs to mean for me to interrupt that, whether it is how I vote, whether that is what politics I participate in or don't participate in, whether it's what I talk to my neighbors about. My neighbors come over and say, man, Black Lives Matter is terrible, it's racist. Do I sit in that conversation and do nothing? Or do I say, actually, here's a different point of view, right? That's the difference. To me, it's a sense of agency and how activated are you to making the world more just. You can play the game where we're just passive recipients of the world as it is. But I think we generally understand that will simply result in more of what is. And if we want to interrupt that, then it requires actual human agency, action, and effort to do that.
So it's like you're saying, what it requires. The luxury of saying I'm not racist is just that, it's a luxury. It's a passive luxury, right?
Yeah.
I can have this conversation with you. I can say, hey, Brian, I'm not a racist, and I can go home and have my tea and go to bed comfortable.
Yep.
in
Comfortable.
my self-perpetuating cycle.
Yep.
Of that, I married a Mexican and I have black friends, therefore I'm not a racist. All is good, right?
Right. Correct.
What
That's
you're
right.
saying it requires on me is a little bit more not just self-awareness, more curiosity, right? More curiosity to ask the questions, or to seek the kinds of experiences that are not my own. I had this conversation with you yesterday, right? I've never once in my life, no one, my father never had to sit me down and say, here's what you do if you get pulled over. I was just socialized into a system whereby I assumed I would be nervous, because everyone gets nervous when lights flash behind them. But other than that, I assumed to be a fairly innocuous transaction, right? The officer would tell me what I did wrong. I'd give him my license. He would either write me a ticket or not, and we'd both go about our day. Right? And that's not what you're describing. That's not what you're describing to me. And that's the, if you will, the kind of gap between the two, right? The gap between saying not racist and being an anti-racist, correct?
Yep, that's correct. That's an outstanding summation. Thank you.
So what have you found then to be among the impediments to people hearing you describe that and then saying, okay, I'm in, right?
Yeah.
What impediments did they erect, to hear what you say, to say, yes, Brian, that sounds great, but then nothing happens, right?
Yeah. So I think, one, there is just a a substantial level of just ignorance about the history of the country, right? We just saw the president pull this, we're going to make a 1776 commission to talk about patriotic education, and the gap, right, and sort of the attacking of the 1619 project, which was a perfectly reasonable historical project in New York Times, looking at the impact of slavery over the history of the country. Anyone that has read a history book of any rigor knows that's actually not. That is among the least controversial statements you could possibly make in American history. Yes, of course, you had a system established, a chattel-based slavery system with forced labor camps, in which you had whole states where half the population was put in a forced labor camp. That has done something to the DNA of that community and the DNA of the country. We should talk about this like grown-ups, right? But most folks don't know that, right? People are told that slaves were simply laborers who were happy. I mean, all of this stuff that's just crazy. And you're like, no one really. Yes, people do. And so you have generation upon generation of that. There is just an authorized obliviousness, right? It's a little like, pull out of race and put it into gender for a second. There is a way in which, as a man, I can walk the world wholly oblivious about the experience of women and female identifying folk in this world, and it would not be a hard thing to do, right? It is easy, and yet it takes conscious effort to fight against that. To be curious, gosh, what was the experience like? Did I say something? Can you help me understand? Is there anything, right? Just the modicum of curiosity that you need in order to try to empathize with someone else's experience, so that way you can stand in solidarity with them. And I think it's the standing in solidarity piece that I want us to get to, but you have to have the empathy, which means you have to sort of have at least enough of the facts, right? I think when we talk about, when I've gone to the campus and talked about police before, what I've just said is, like, the stories like about George Floyd, Breonna Taylor, all those incredibly heartrending stories, those happen far more than folks care to know. In my community, we know them, and we could rattle off those young people who were killed and those experiences. And that time someone's auntie got shot and she didn't do nothing. But most white Americans have no idea, and so they're shocked when there's all this pent up frustration and rage and anger that is wholly justifiable. And they're like, "But I just thought the police were lovely people and nothing was wrong." It's like, well, did you ask anybody? Right. This is also a reflection of the fact that we've designed a society where people are deeply segregated, right? We are segregated in church, we are segregated in school, we're segregated at the grocery store, we're segregated where we live, we're segregated where we die, all of it. And so there is a way in which, certainly as a white person, one can move through the world wholly oblivious to the experience of African Americans, Latinos, and Asian Americans. And you got to really fight against that. Like the system is designed for you never to be curious, so you actually have to fight actively against that.
Yeah, I mean, I'll say for myself, part for me was, you and I know each other going many years back to our days at St. Mary's College in California.
Mm-hmm.
A college set in the bucolic hills of the east
Beautiful.
side of San Francisco. Right, beautiful. We both agree. Beautiful
Right.
campus, beautiful setting. That was the first time I had ever heard from you as a student and others and some of my colleagues how often you had been pulled over by the police.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
Right? Something that was entirely new to me was like routine to
Right.
your experience, correct?
You just simply expected it to happen, and you made sure you had your documents in order, and you handled your business quickly, lest it escalate to something worse.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. So have you had an experience then of those who've been willing to take that step?
Mm-hmm.
And what have they done that you have seen that that they've taken that step? What did they? I guess what I'm looking for is what is it that they have signaled by either their actions or their words to you
Mm-hmm.
that tells you they're serious about this?
So I think they're curious, right? I think they're curious about they don't come up and say, Brian, tell me all about black people.
Mm-hmm.
That's not going to get you what you want from me, I assure you. But they're curious. They're curious about so maybe they're reading books. They're not reading like, I don't have a problem with the book How to Be an Anti-Racist. I think that's a great introductory for lots of folks. It's an easy on ramp. But they're reading books by and about communities that they know nothing about, whether it is African American or Chicano literature or APA literature, whatever it is. They're curious about it, and they're reading and they're trying to learn. They're trying to enter humbly. I think the other part of this is it has to be rooted in humility, that you can't go in and assume that you know it and that you're just looking for validation for what you know, but you're actually entering that, exploring, trying to understand what you actually don't know. It's some things you don't know, some things you don't know, which you're also pretty clear. Like, I'm not exactly sure I'm going to be able to understand it, but I'm going to try. I'm going to sit in this. I'm going to sit in this discomfort and embrace this challenge and this opportunity for me to get better in the world. So I think when I see folks do those things, I think if that's really positive. They're doing the work on themselves, right? They're exploring their own privilege, their own power, their own history, and trying to understand how they got to where they're at so that they can begin to understand how they move to where they want to be. So where that is, they're doing their own work. I have lots of white friends who do white allies groups in which they just sort of sit and talk through some of these issues. I don't want to be in those conversations. I don't need to be in those conversations. I quite frankly don't find them super I find them frustrating for me because I'm like, I'm not buying any excuse about why you don't know this. That's just too bad. And that's not helpful, right? Because they're in the place to learn. So I actually need to give them grace to learn, and grace to say, I don't know, and let's do the work about so that way they do know, right? So hence I try not to get in those spaces because my own feelings come up. That's my work, not their work, but I want to give them that work they're doing is key. So I look for signs like that, right? Where folks are really stepping into the work of learning, both learning what racism is, what it looks like, how it is manifested, and who they are, and how they move through the world, and then trying to unpack that to figure out what are new ways for them to do that. Again, in solidarity with communities that are bearing the brunt of racism on a daily basis.
I would imagine, yes, that there's only so many times that, say, a group of white people get together, that they're serious about this, that they're investigating this, they're you said they're examining their own lives, their own privilege, and learning more. I imagine there's only so many times that someone could say to you, "Oh my God, really?" And you can say, "Yes, really." I mean, so many times probably, right? That you can respond to that where I think you said rightly that you have to step out of that, right? And let them or let us have those conversations and figure this stuff out.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. Yeah, for me, I think as a black man in those conversations, I can't do it. Like it's just like I have a finite amount, and it's like, look, you ain't learned nothing in 35 years about, and then that's not helpful, right? It doesn't mean there may not be a place for that. There might be, and that maybe there may be because that's appropriate, but I think if usually folks are moving the work in the right direction, then I'm happy to come alongside and be an ally to that work when it's appropriate. Um, Otherwise, I'm just like, bah, that's not
Yeah.
good.
Yeah, and what I have found in the last couple of days here, we've been doing these reflections on camp through via Zoom, Google Meets for the community here, and for some of us here too, have been reading some of these books you mentioned. One of them is White Rage, is another one, which
Mm-hmm.
is again, I think for you, you would read and go, yes, yes, yes. You flip to the pages, and go, yes, yes, right. But for some people, they're reading and going, oh my god,
Yeah.
right? Lincoln's a much more complex person than just the guy who wrote the Emancipation Proclamation and freed the
Mm-hmm.
slaves. He
Mm-hmm.
actually had some attitudes we would call racist today,
Mm-hmm.
right? And it makes him a much more complex person. And that's for those socialized in a certain way of seeing history,
Mm-hmm.
that's uncomfortable, right?
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
And what I hear you saying is, we need to sit in that discomfort, right? With
Right.
encountering that history, which we have either uh, knowingly or unknowingly or knowingly set aside,
Yep.
right? A
Yep.
certain kind of way of wanting to think about history.
Yep. Yeah, I think I remember a while back when Texas was doing a big school book issue, and there was an incredible amount of controversy over how they talked about slavery.
Mhm.
And the controversy is general, like in the Civil War. I remember for a long time, I think it might still be true that books in the South didn't didn't identify slavery as a root cause of the Civil War. It was all other issues besides slavery, because the implication for lots of folks was really hard to reconcile that their grandparents went to fight and defend slavery. So you had to make it about states' rights. You had to make it about other things, because that was a way of protecting oneself, right?
Mhm.
Think that my grandpa, my great grandpa wasn't a slaver, but he fought on their behalf. Is a terror, like that's just, oh really, oh man.
Mhm.
And so there's a lot of that. There's a lot of that in which the reality of the history of the world that explains much of how we got here is structured such as to minimize the pain for communities that actually bear some responsibility. And instead of trusting that people can hear that truth, be challenged by its meaning, and then rise to a better self, uh, that's not how we do. We tell folks what they need to hear so they feel good, and then that then distorts how they understand themselves and how they understand their place in the world. And those two things work together then to simply reinforce what is. And so I think that's really the push of when I think of folks who are doing good anti-racist work is you should be uncomfortable. It should be hard. You should have a moment where the rubber is meeting the road and you're feeling kind of squished in the middle, and you're going to have to navigate that. And there are lots of ways to do it and people who help and all of that. But at the end of the day, you're going to have to do the work. So,
And what I've come to understand about this work also is that it doesn't let anyone off the hook as far as part of the comfort again of saying, I'm not a racist is, well, I grew up in California or I've lived in the North
mm-hmm,
and the race is a Southern problem, right? The Civil War happened
mm-hmm,
there. That's where the slavery was.
mm-hmm,
That's been a Southern problem. And oh, look, we see on the news these things happening in North Carolina or white supremacist groups here or there. And it kind of
mm-hmm.
reinforces this comfortable narrative for someone like myself growing up in California or living in the North that it's their problem, not my problem. What
Correct. Yep.
anti-racism asks of us is, no, sir, actually, it is your problem as well.
That's right. Yeah, that's right. Yeah, I think the challenge and invitation of sort of anti-racist work done well is you generally can find yourself in sort of somewhere in that. You can generally find yourself in a place where some way, some belief that you have has shown up consciously. In most cases, I would suspect consciously, and you either got to respond to it with better, or you're going to stay there. And and there are lots of ways. It's one of the reasons why I'm not, this might be somewhat controversial, but I'm not a huge fan of implicit bias, mainly because I think it takes people off the hooks for their commitment to deeply racist ideas. And I just think that's cheating. Like, you don't get to be like, oh, I didn't realize I have all this bias against black men, but you ain't got no black friends in your peer group. If your child brought home, if your daughter brought home, or your son brought home a black man who they were dating, you're not exactly sure how you're going to feel about that, right? I mean, you can run down the list like, actually, you're pretty committed to this idea. You probably should talk about that with someone who loves you to figure out what you're going to do different versus saying it's just my implicit bias and simply letting yourself off the hook for being in control of how your brain works.
Yeah, I this is an experience I've long thought about when I was in graduate school. In Berkeley, walking home one night, holding a book in my hand, reading, catching up on things, not, kind of walking and trying to pay attention to my peripheral vision. And I saw someone coming towards me, and I walked to get out of the way of the person. And the person actually stopped and turned to me and said, "Did you just get out of the way because I'm black?" And I thought afterwards, what if I did?
Yeah.
Maybe I did. Maybe I did. I don't want to believe that, right?
Yeah.
But I very well could have, just simply having been shaped in the very kinds of ways you're talking about, and not being willing to ask questions about, at that time in my life, about the things that had shaped me or organized my way of thinking or seeing the
world. Yeah, I think that's a great example of how that works. Where, yeah, you might have, and the question is, why would I do that?
Yeah.
Right. What is it? What are the beliefs I'm holding somewhere in my being that leads me to believe that a black man walking towards me at the middle of UC Berkeley
at night
is a threat? At night is a threat versus another student, a teacher, the janitor, a professor. I mean, whoever, anyone. They're just trying to get home, just like you. But something in there, and again, if one doesn't take ownership of that, then it becomes easy to say, "That's just my bias coming up. I can't control that. I'm good." And it's like, no. We should do that. Are you here for your appearance, Parker? Very good. Come here. Oh boy, say hello to Mr. Chris.
Hello, Parker.
All right. I don't know where the remote controls are, so you have to wait till I get. Oh, dang it! I just told you. Okay, sorry. School at home.
Yes,
is terrible. I'm going to send them to you guys. Is what I'm going to do.
Yes. So someone has emailed a question and says, "Do you see any initial steps being taken by any police forces that give you the belief that real change is coming in their approach to populations of color?"
Well, let's see, changes in police forces. There are definitely, so what I think about there are the cosmetic changes. Hello, TJ. There are the cosmetic changes that people will make in this moment, right? They will say, let's do anti-bias training for our officers. They might say, let's everyone put on body cams. Then there are the deeper structural changes that are much harder to get. And there's been great writing recently on police union contracts with cities that essentially create an alternative form of justice. So there's a reason why the officers who shot Breonna Taylor haven't been arrested yet. There's a reason why the officers in Kenosha weren't immediately arrested. I mean, there's reasons why these things occur, and they sort of occur fairly consistently. So I think interrupting that would suggest a level of progress and commitment to say that, one of some philosopher theory, I'm going to butcher who it was, so I'm not going to try, said something about that in essence it is the state that should be the only one that has a monopoly on violence, right? And so in our society, we charge police with being able to exercise that. And they've exercised it not super well across the board. And because there's no accountability for that, no one, certainly no one in my community has, or very few people in my community have very much optimism that something they're going to get better. So you need mechanisms to reinforce the accountability, and folks don't like that. People don't believe that, particularly people who do not view that behavior by the police as problematic. They aren't interested in having that accountability. And so what I would look for in terms of signs of good progress are the union contracts changing? Are we making meaningful adjustments to qualified immunity so when officers act in ways that are completely out of bounds, if there's a way to hold them accountable for that, just like we hold anybody else accountable. Breonna Taylor's family got $12 million, but their baby girl is gone, and they got $12 million of taxpayer money, and we'll find out in a couple of days whether or not those officers are tried by the grand jury. I'm going to assume no, but I hope I'm wrong. But if that actually ends up happening, that means they murdered someone. The city cut them $12 million of taxpayer money, and they'll still be police officers next week, either in Louisville or someplace else. Interrupting that system is the progress I think everyone wants to see. What I said before, my last point on this is, nobody is. I think what people are longing for is competent policing. Many communities have gotten policing that is stunningly incompetent, stunningly unhelpful, right? Murder closure rates in urban cities are single digits in most cases. And there's a reason they're not good at that work, because they've burned all the community relationships you need in order to solve problems. And so that's incompetent policing. I would love to have competent policing in my community. And that is what I yearn for, because I think that actually can be a benefit. But we don't have that now, and we won't until we get some of those deeper structural fixes in how we think about police and community fixed.
And do you find then that I asked earlier the question of the ways in which people almost reflexively erect barriers to kind of maintain a certain comfort zone around themselves?
Yeah.
Do you find in this instance is one of those reflexive responses? Reform, yes, but defund, no.
Yeah, I mean, I think it's interesting. I can speak for Oakland, but in most large cities, the police department budget is like half the budget. Like half the budget. Now that means that money is competing with park and recs and road repairs and arts programs, all the things that people want, and all that work that can do quite a bit to reduce community violence, right? If you have a meaningful arts program and a great basketball and great sport rec program and all kinds of things for people to do besides maybe rip around the streets and get themselves a little bit of trouble, those are good things. And yet, when people said defund the police, I think people assume. I think they took the fringiest element of that movement and said they want to get rid of all the police. And there are plenty of people who are happy to abolish the police, to be clear. That does not represent the preponderance of people who just want competent policing and would prefer the police not harass and abuse and beat and kill them. That feels like a low bar to get over. I think we can do this as America. So I think when people heard that, they sprinted to the most extreme end. And there are lots of folks in lots of cities who are saying, wait, why exactly are we giving you all this money? Do you really need a tank to do your job? Do you really need, why you don't need that? Can we replace that tank with a new basketball court in the community that might be helpful, or a new after school program that is discounted so parents ain't got to work 3 jobs to pay for after school care for their babies? Can we do something different with those dollars that actually advances the end of community safety that we want in different ways? So a live example was when we moved here in West Oakland, we had some activity on the corner. Recommendation from the city was just call the police. We're like, well, that's stupid. I don't want them in jail. I would just like them to have something else to do besides sit in my corner and sell drugs. Can we figure something else out for these gentlemen? So we went out, we talked to them a little bit, got to know them some, and then the city has had a woefully underfunded violence prevention program in which other young men who had previously been on corners were hired by the city to go and actually work with those young men, help them think about different career paths, getting back to school, begin to move their lives in the right direction. That's what we went with. It was a much better solution. I didn't have to call the police. No one had to get shot. No one's daddy had to get hauled off to prison. They were able to actually help those young men think through other things and get them connected services to help them move their lives in a different, more sustainable direction. We need more programs like that. That's what defund the police ultimately really means.
Yeah, and you mentioned then the again, what I'm hearing is part of this movement towards like identifying the fringiest elements
Mm-hmm.
and saying, well, I can't go with defund the police because of X, right? The
Mm-hmm.
fringe part of it, again, seems to be a way, again, kind of maintaining that comfort zone,
Mm-hmm.
right? Of saying, I'm not a racist, so I'm good, right?
Yeah.
Um, so give me your what you hear then also when you hear someone say something like, Black Lives Matter. Yes, I think Black Lives Matter, and I could support them if only, right? If only fill in the blank. If
Right. Whatever
only
it is.
there weren't riots. If only there
Right.
wasn't violence. If only they weren't, calling to defund the police.
Right.
What do you hear when you hear those kinds of, kind of yes, but
Yeah.
kind
I mean, I more or less hear the same thing I'm sure folks heard during the civil rights movement. I think Martin Luther King had like a 30% or 20% national approval rating until he was shot. Then it jumped like 90%, right? I think there were people who said, I letters from a Birmingham jail, right? People who said, actually, you should just move patiently and ask graciously, and we'll get there. And it's like, what are you talking about? This is crazy. This is America. What you treat people like that for? And so I think there's not that is pretty consistent, right? The sort of the what did King say? He came down quite hard on the white moderate for a reason, right? Because the let's move slower toward justice argument doesn't really work. It's actually pretty insulting, quite frankly. It's like you should continue to be in pain. Your community should continue to suffer until I feel like I'm ready to do the work to grant you the rights that you deserve as a person that lives in this country. That's insane. And intuitively people know it's insane. They're like, that's crazy. What are you talking about? So when I hear people caveat their commitment to Black Lives Matter, I'm like, oh well, then you don't actually support the work, right? There are fringe elements and there people do things all the time I disagree with. It doesn't actually mean that I then attach that to that entire movement and say, well, the whole thing is garbage. I sort of think actually they're right, and we should figure out what does it mean for us to ensure that our criminal justice system uh, um, doesn't operate as it currently operates, because the way it's operating now isn't just problematic. It is deeply unjust, and it requires some fairly radical corrections in order to do better. Whether it is how we sentence people, whether it's how we treat prisoners. In California, an astronomically high percentage of prisoners got COVID. It didn't have to be that way, but we did it anyway, right? Does that make any sense at all? And then we release folks back into the communities and they go home and get their people sick. That doesn't make income. That's what are we talking about, right? So there is something to be said for when I hear people say, I would support Black Lives Matter, but I'm like, well, then not exactly sure you're really supporting it, because you'll always find something, right? If you're looking to justify not supporting something because someone spoke a little too sharply, uh, then you'll find that. And I would say one should probably think very carefully about the luxury of that, right? Just about the luxury of being able to say, I'm not going to support this because I don't like this word they muttered here, or this thing, this part of whatever statement I read on Twitter. That doesn't make any sense.
Yeah. I'm going to pull up here just again for people who might be watching the screen here that has the title of tonight. And if you would like to send in a question for Brian or myself for our conversation, you can send that into vpmission@sjcme.edu. So I'll leave it up there for a little bit. So let me admit something here, because I think it's part of what I'm just, again, the reflexive response one has, especially for someone like myself, socialized as I was. I mean, I'm the quintessential white 70s suburban kid, right? So and wanting to justify it within the framework of having a PhD in theology.
Mm-hmm.
Years ago, the first time I heard Black Lives Matter, my reflexive response was all lives matter,
Mm-hmm.
right?
Mm-hmm.
Again, the question I want to ask you is not so much what would you, should you, or what would you say, but it's like, what do you hear when someone says that? When they say, well, all lives matter, or don't all lives matter?
Yeah, so I would tend to say if someone says all lives matter, if I'm wearing my Black Lives Matter T-shirt in, I don't know, Petaluma or something, and someone says all lives matter to me, I probably would say, then great, then you agree, Black Lives Matter as well. We're good. I'm good with that, right? And I would keep it stepping because I'm not going to. Clearly means I'm not interested in having a 20-minute conversation. I think um, sometimes people like to be provocative and they like to poke a little bit and they like to see what happens. Um, and that's sort of how I feel about All Lives Matter. I think by this point, people know better than to fire back with All Lives Matter. But I think when this all started, that was people's initial response. And I think what we've learned is when we don't talk explicitly about race in America, we then do our conversations a pretty big disservice when we pretend that I can say all lives and assume that means Black lives when we know, as I said earlier, our country is so deeply segregated um, and so wildly unequal that it misses the mark in a way that I think can feel hurtful for folks and can feel dismissive of their community. And no one said all lives matter before people said Black Lives Matter. That was not the conversation at all. So it was literally created as a response to a plea for better treatment and justice from our Black citizens in this country. And so I think, again, this is one of those moments where having some historical awareness is helpful. Because if you know that, you're like, right, I can see why that is not a helpful way to frame that question.
And we've been talking about in terms of what I or any individual might do, taking seriously an
Mm-hmm.
anti-racist perspective, right? The work I can do, or the work I can do in conversation with others. I'm thinking about the work that we can undertake as a nation. And let me give you
Mm-hmm.
an analogy or an example. It took Germany and the countries kind of under Nazi occupation probably about 40 to 50 years to come to terms with the Holocaust.
Mm-hmm.
Now, if you travel to Germany, like Berlin, there are explicit memorials that say this many people died. This happened, and this many people died in this place
Mm-hmm.
at this time. But in
Mm-hmm.
the United States, we really don't have those memorials. We don't have those. We don't. We seem to have not or been unable to come to some kind of honest reckoning with slavery and its
Mm-hmm.
heritage.
Mm-hmm.
Um, at the very least, like I said, even memorials that say Emmett Till was killed here, people
Yeah.
were hung here, this was
Yeah.
people were lynched here. Um, in your experience, why do we seem unable to want to take that step?
Because to own that history is to own a part of it, right? Is to own, Emmett Till Memorial. They've had to make it bulletproof because the little plaque where he got killed, they just shoot it up constantly. Um, uh, and it's a source of, I think, horror for that community. They're like, why do we keep having to replace this thing with? It's ridiculous. And they know it's ridiculous, but it's their children that are doing it. Ain't no one driving in from California to shoot the Emmett Till Memorial. Come on. Um, and so I think when you own that history, it is heavy. I mean, the history of slavery, the sort of the chattel slavery experience of this country is devastating. The stories, the narratives, it is devastating. There was a article in NPR about black newspapers in the North after the Civil War just running page after page of "Have you seen?" ads. People try. And like you could, it's like you just, it's heavy, and it is easier to just not think about that, right? America has a very strong bias towards the future, a very strong bias towards youth, It is always, tomorrow is always going to be better than today. So why worry about today? Um, when in fact you can learn a lot from today, right? You can learn a lot from the past and what happened. I remember when I was talking to a friend when the whole "Okay Boomer" thing was jumping off, maybe last spring, as a meme of sort of young people dismissing elders, right? And I just said, I'm not doing "Okay Boomer" because my elders, I stand on their shoulders because the stuff they went through. Look, they got some lessons to teach me about how to navigate the world as an adult, and I'm going to pass those down to my children. But still, it's this notion of we're just going to dismiss that history. We're going to dismiss those old people because what do they know? And we're going to look forward. Well, then you end up losing part of your history. I mean, the reason why Germany has to continue to do that is because if they don't, they understand, they know history, right? They understand that people forget about the Holocaust. It's likely to happen again. There was just a study done in maybe it was Pew or someone where they said something like 15 or 20% of people under the age, I'm going to say about 20, didn't know about the Holocaust. So 15, 20%. I'm like, how is that possible? Right? But that's because we don't talk about World War II. All those generations are dying or gone in many cases. And so, I remember when you brought a group of Holocaust, I think they're Holocaust survivors mostly, to the campus to sing. I don't know what that woman sang. I don't know what language she was singing in, but my heart was falling. Like whatever it was, you could hear you like, all right, I got you, mama. This ain't. I'm gonna do whatever I can to not let this happen to you again. But we don't have that same experience around slavery, and if you don't attend to it, people forget and they walk away, and as a result, you get a lot of the same things that can happen again.
And what I hear you saying is part of the work then that I can undertake is again checking that socialization towards that American propensity towards looking to the future, let go of the past,
Mm-hmm.
as
Yeah.
if as if progress is the only goal,
Yep.
right?
That's right.
And progress requires a forgetting of some sort in order
That's
to
right.
have progress, right?
That's right. That's right. Yeah, I think that's right on.
Whereas actual progress can be it being okay, as you said earlier, with discomfort,
Mm-hmm.
okay with some kind of reckoning,
Mm-hmm.
and you said earlier about that reckoning might very well mean that if I send in my DNA swab to ancestry.com,
Mm-hmm.
find out that some of my ancestors were slave owners,
Mm-hmm.
right? And
Yep.
this is years ago. There's a PBS series, Finding My Roots, with Dr. Henry
Mm-hmm.
Gates.
Oh yeah, yeah, I remember
And
that. Yeah.
that show, PBS almost canceled that show
Mm-hmm.
when one of the celebrities that he hosted found out that he was a descendant of a slave owner, and he made them keep that information out of the show
Yep. Oh wow.
because it was so uncomfortable,
Yeah.
right? And
Yeah.
we seem unwilling to sit with that discomfort. Now, I
Yep.
shouldn't say we as in the general royal we. White people are uncomfortable, right? Sitting with that discomfort
Yeah.
of perhaps one of their family members having had a role in
Yeah.
this.
Well, I mean, it's there are members of Black community who don't want to tell stories about slavery, who want to walk away from that history and think of that as a source of weakness. And I'm like, I don't pretend to understand one millionth of what the experience of my ancestors were who were slaves, but I know they made it,
Mm-hmm.
and that strikes me as an incredible source of strength, given the little bit I understand about how the horror of that experience. And so I draw from that as a source of strength for me. But there are lots of folks who I think, for different reasons, come to the similar point of I don't want to talk about that history. I don't want to talk about that. I don't want to explore that. I'm not curious about that. I think it comes at great cost to them as well. Again, it looks different to be clear. Um, but I think when you deny history, then you are being willfully ignorant about what is today by trying to not understand what was and how we got here. And I just think that's extremely costly.
You think also that denial? I just thought of this in our earlier conversation too about your needing to step away from these conversations, right?
Mm-hmm.
White people having these conversations, you need to step out of that. Do you think that um, ignorance of a sort, right? Of that again, being comfortable with that notion of moving forward, letting go of the past, setting aside that discomfort. Do you think it also then creates um, the right word I'm trying to think of is it creates the platform by which then I come to you and start asking you as my black friend to help me understand the black community better.
Hmm. Yeah, yeah. I think when you are, you look. I think people look for safe ways to try to explore communities that they don't know or things they don't know. And race in America is one of those topics that always feels radioactive and always feels fraught, because it is kind of fraught a lot. Uh, and as a result, people look for the safest ways to go, without recognizing the impact that has on someone who you voluntold to be your guide through
Mm-hmm.
their community. Like I don't want to do that. I'm good, thank you. Um, or at least you haven't established the deep trust. I think one of the ways that race is really interesting in relationships is people often think you're friends with someone and you don't know them. You don't know them at all, actually. And you've not spent any time getting your relationship past the most transactional level. You may think you have, but the actual state of the relationship, as seen through the other person's eyes, is you my work friend. We talk about work stuff. At 5 o'clock, I go home. You go home, and never the two shall meet. And so, if you call me on Saturday and say, "Hey, can we get a beer?" It's like, what now? Is this a work thing? I'm confused. And your goal is to say, "I'd love you to teach me all about your community." I don't think so, right? So I do think there is something about the need for comfort in doing that. For some folks, and actually, my guidance is you're gonna have to push through that. You're gonna have to be uncomfortable. I don't. I think for me, when I read books about feminism, written by women of color, and they're talking about their experience with sexism, it is some uncomfortable reading because you're like, ooh, oh, ooh, okay. I might have to go make some amends to somebody. I think I did that. I didn't know, right? But I think that for me is the only example I can think of that feels similar in terms of having to humble yourself and enter into and at least explore a set of ideas that might have implications for how you've shown up and should challenge you to think differently about how you will show up from this point forward.
If I understand you correctly, too, that if I take seriously this work of kind of self-assessment, something I hear from other white people when I'm having this conversation sometimes is, well, I'm afraid that I'm going to say the wrong thing. And I think what I'm hearing you say is, yes, you are. That's okay, and it's okay to be uncomfortable with that.
Yeah,
Correct?
yeah. I mean, if you were going to say it perfectly every time, we probably wouldn't need to have these conversations. But since you don't know what you don't know, entering into those dialogues humbly and understanding you're going to screw it up, right? I'm pretty clear most of the time when I'm talking to white folk who are in the midst of this kind of work that there's like an 89% chance they're going to say something wrong, and I have to decide how I'm going to respond. Right? Again, that by virtue of the person I am, the types of work I've done and do, this is inevitable. I'm in that space often, and so you definitely have to work on extending people grace. You definitely have to work on being quick to say, "I think I said that wrong. Let me stop and apologize to you now for the way I said that." I think I had an experience in a previous job. We had someone who was non-binary, and every time, like I remember I was talking to them and they said, well, I said, well, when someone misgenders you, right, they use the wrong pronoun. What's the how should that be handled? Like what's the correct way? And they said, well, you should just correct it and move on. And I was like, really? And they're like, yeah, because the alternative is you then make me do all this emotional labor for you, right? You're like, oh, I'm so sorry, and you make literally, it's okay. This is a new concept for us all. We're working on it, and I appreciate that you realize you did it wrong and you fixed it. But if you make me do all this emotional labor, then it's terrible. And I feel terrible. Actually, I feel angry and frustrated. I got to do this again. You're crying, and it's like I didn't want all that. I just need you to say you said she and you meant they. You fix it, and we move on with our day. That was cool. Now you'd have made it a thing, and now it's a thing. Now we got to do a thing. So I think there's something in that.
And I put you in the position of having to comfort me because I got it wrong.
Yes, that's right. That's right. Versus, my bad, let's keep it moving. It's fine. Now, if it happens every minute for an hour, we may need to have a different conversation. But they were clear, like, most of the time, people who just get it, like, 2-3 times, and they're good. They'll be good for like 9 months if they make the mistake again, which is great. People that do the whole drama, they're like, guaranteed it's going to come back again another week. Watch.
Yeah, you mentioned I had that experience a few years ago when I was asked to come speak. My former institution was a Gay Straight Alliance for their coming out day, and during my talk, I said things like our brothers and sisters, and then during the conversation part, they said, actually, it's more than that. And it was great. I mean, because we have to be okay with a community telling us, look, this is who we are, and this is how we want you to talk with us, right? You want to take us seriously, and you want to respect us, right?
Yep, that's right.
That's right. This is, for me, in this work I've been doing here now since I came to St. Joseph's, in conversations with some of my coworkers here, we were talking about addressing anti-racism here at the college, looking at systems and structures, and I said, it's going to require some uncomfortable conversations. And a Black coworker said, uncomfortable for some, and I got it. What he meant by that, right? That is, what I was describing as discomfort is because it's uncomfortable to me. To him, he's been having these conversations all his life, right?
It's just Tuesday.
Yes, exactly.
Right.
So again, we have to be, part of this is the work we have to do for ourselves is we have to be okay with that.
Yeah.
Right?
Yeah.
We have to be okay with that. Sometimes people are going to say, hey, look, unprompted, hey, look, you said this, you need to know what I heard when you said this.
Yep, that's right.
Respond with the I'm so sorry, or put you in the position of then having to comfort me because I got it wrong.
Yep, that's right.
Say, thank you.
Yep.
Thank you. That's helpful. Right?
Yeah, and I would also say, if you don't understand why, I think that's the one to say,
yes.
Can I just ask for you just to help me understand why or what else I should think about, so that way next time I don't make the same mistake again. And if I hear someone else making it, I can also be supportive of that, right? Like, I think it's, again, I love the framing of uncomfortable for who, right? That I really appreciate. So I'm going to use that tomorrow in a meeting, actually. Think about it, because there's something to be said for projecting the discomfort, making it more fraught. And actually, this is okay. This is okay. We're gonna be all right. I'm gonna extend you some grace, and I'm gonna expect some reciprocal humility in return. And we're gonna move through this, and you're gonna be better for it, and you won't make the same mistake the same way for the same reason again.
Yeah, to kind of draw our conversation to a close, where we began then with is the work of anti-racism. Something you said to me is, I think, very interesting here is the work of anti-racism in that situation would not just be my hearing you and saying thank you, or asking you about the perspective or help me understand it better, but also the work of anti-racism is I'm going to find myself very likely in some circumstance in the future where I hear someone else use the terminology or the language or address someone the way I did once in a conversation with you. The work of anti-racism is now for me to say, hey, look, right?
Yep.
And again, not to step aside and say, well, I said this to Brian and he's here and he took care of it for me, so now I'm just going to rely on him to take care of it for
That's right.
over here.
That's right.
Working anti-racism is my willingness now to step in and say,
Yep.
hey, look, you understand what it is you're saying here, what you've just said, and how that was
Yep.
heard, and what you how you might reframe what it is you just said. Correct?
Yeah. I mean, I think we all have an obligation to do work to make the world a better place,
Mm-hmm.
right? We can call that's Lasallian, that's Jesuit. I was going to say Jesuitan, but that's not actually a word. It could be Sisters of Mercy, Jesuitical. Thank you. Oh, look at that biblical stuff. Just pull it out. And so I just think all of those frames really call us to realize our own agency in making the world a better place. No one else is going to do it for us, right? We've tried that. It doesn't actually work, right? We all have an obligation to do good where we're at and do good and address wrong and injustice where we see it. And so I think that's really to me, that's how I hear. This is why I don't hear dissonance between anti-racism and Catholic social justice. Like these things are all friends. It all's trying to get to the same point to say you are here on this earth to do good where you are at, and your job is to do good. And it doesn't matter how hard it is. It doesn't matter if it makes you uncomfortable. It doesn't matter if it might mean you may make someone upset with you because you said that's wrong. We should do better, and I want to help you. I want to stand solidarity with you in that work. But that to me is a core commandment. So I'm excited.